Yes, I can see you. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, so in this video, I'd like to talk about the issue we discussed earlier, which was that comment that I left on, I don't remember where, it could have been CNN, NBC, I don't know. But, and I don't even remember the actual video, but it pertained to Vice President Kamala Harris. And I left a comment on a video, to paraphrase, saying something to the effect of, okay, great VP, but what about these millions of undefended civilian workers who were with the statutory and apparent authority of the governments of the United States and Britain and others, were, violated, their wages 100% confiscated for their entire working lives for a cumulative duration of 244 years, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. And um, the usual question that I ask in these situations. And there was this one comment that came back that said something to the effect, to paraphrase, that I should name even one country where slavery didn't occur, especially at that time. And the person, I assume it was a woman, went on to talk about who was an American, a descendant of a slave in America, or who was not a descendant of an American slave, or just, excuse me, just arguments and statements and things that I did not think were relevant to this argument for compensation, restitution, reparation, and justice for the millions of undefended civilian workers who happen to come from Africa, who were extrajudicially enslaved, extrajudicially imprisoned, extrajudicially trafficked for a cumulative 244 years, with the statutory and apparent authority of very powerful governments, including the United States and Britain, but not limited to them, certainly, and who had done absolutely nothing wrong. At least the records do not show that any of them had committed any wrongdoing to merit, deserve, or warrant this severe type of punishment for this outrageously long duration of time. Okay. And for me, the notion that there are people who are making the argument that everybody did it or everybody has done it, and so therefore nobody should bear any accountability and nobody should bear any responsibility, is a notion that I have to respectfully reject categorically. I think, you know, there are wrongs and then there are wrongs. There's small wrongs, there are medium sized wrongs, there are big wrongs, and then there are whoppers like what occurred for 244 years cumulatively in in North America, with the authority of the British monarchy, the British government, and the American government, and certainly other governments as well, who probably bear at least a moral obligation for the moral debt that was incurred when these innocent civilians were attacked so egregiously. But because of the existence of the British Magna Carta, which has never been on hiatus, which has been in effect and in force uninterruptedly for over 800 years in Britain, and certainly was in effect at the time that British subjects went into Africa and proceeded to divest millions of people of their liberty, their rights, without due process of law, without, a jury of their peers, without a jury at all, without a judge, but, they had done nothing wrong. And, still that they committed these egregious violations against these people, is one that is particularly troubling because, Britain is a nation of laws, and from those laws came the laws of the United States, which itself is a nation of laws and describes itself as a nation of laws. There's been a constitution in the United States since circa 1789, after the American Revolutionary War that was won against Britain, right? And since that time, America has not answered to the British monarch, but has answered to itself and to the Constitution, and that's been 230 years approximately. Even in that Constitution, there have been violations of the rights of these millions of civilian workers who had done nothing wrong. When you confiscate someone's wages for their entire working lives, and not 50%, not 60%, not 90%, you confiscate 100%. So that's equivalent to a 100% withholding tax of someone's wages for their entire life, and everybody in their community, you do the same thing for their entire lives for a cumulative 244 years, and none of these individuals, none of these people have done anything wrong. There's something very wrong about that at a minimum. And the notion that, well, everybody did it, so therefore, nobody's responsible, it just doesn't jive for me. If you look, for example, at the attacks on the nation's capital in the United States on January 6th, 2021, there were thousands and thousands of people there, and many people participated in this wrongdoing. The notion that someone is going to raise the defense that everybody was there and everybody was doing it is not a reason that that particular individual should not bear the consequences of this wrongful act. And as big as that wrongful act was, I don't think it's as big as taking 17 million people out of their very humanity, despeciating 17 million people, approximately 17 million people, 17 million people, again, being approximately the equivalence of the entire population of modern day Sweden, which is about 10 million people, the entire population of Jamaica, which is about 2.5 million people, plus the entire population of Armenia and the entire population of Montenegro combined. That's 17 million people, okay? You take 17 million people, you despeciate them, you deprive them of all of their rights, human rights, civil rights, constitutional rights, speech rights, property rights, the right to the very membership in their species, okay? And you have laws, you have written laws that say that this exact kind of thing, taking someone's property without compensation, subjecting people to cruel and inhuman punishment without due process of law, etc., etc. You have laws that say that this can't happen, right? You're not a lawless country. You're not a dictatorship. You're not a terrorist nation where, you're not Al Qaeda or the Taliban or, all of these other, people. I mean, you are a nation of laws, and you're going to tell me that something like this happens on the nation's watch. Something like this happens on the nation's watch. It's plural, and no one is responsible and no one is accountable because everybody did it or was doing it. I mean, what words can I use for that? It beyond the pale is kind of ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, it is just. I don't have words for that. I don't have words for that. I cannot subscribe to this notion that the fact that slavery had occurred back in biblical times, which I've explained in previous discussions, that it's not the same kind of an animal. Those two things were totally different. In biblical times, it was a maximum of 7 years. The people owned themselves. They were not owned by their masters, okay? Their children were not, multi-generationally enslaved for their wrongdoing. A lot of these people sold themselves into slavery to pay off debts, etc., or they were captured in war. Here you have people who had done absolutely nothing wrong. They were not at war with anybody. They weren't harboring terrorists. They weren't polluting the environment that these people had to breathe and their children had to breathe. They didn't even know these people existed. All they had was where they lived under their tree, their naked bodies. And these people came in and took even that, right? And subjected them to the worst punishment, worse than the worst terrorists that killed 10,000 people in the World Trade Center don't get multi-generational incarcerations of their children. And you tell me that everybody was doing it, and so therefore it's no big whoop, right? No one is accountable. I'm sorry. I just find that really just awful. It's an awful position to take, especially for, the kinds of governments we're talking about, the United States and England, which are two countries that are very highly respected in the world, two countries that are very influential in the world, two countries that go around the rest of the world trying to sell rule of law, sell democracy, sell human rights, and not wanting to or being willing to look within themselves to say, how can we show a better example to the rest of the world that we're trying to change. I mean, it's like a tragic case of like obliviousness and just blindness. It's a form of blindness on the part of these governments, I think, to think that they could go in and dictate rule of law and human rights and democracy without first showing accountability and responsibility for the things they have done that everybody is aware that they have done and that they've never taken responsibility for. And then using and having, citizens use the excuse that everybody did it, so therefore it's quite a right. You know, it's, what can I say? What can I say?